Now, as we conclude today, there's one last thing I want to do to kind of put a fine point on the whole issue of Israel. Do they have the right to the land? And the promises that God made through Abraham, do they extend even to our day and to the people of Israel? We've answered the question about would God bring back a people even in a place of unbelief? And is there precedent for that? Would he use secular sources to do so? And we looked at that question as well. The promises, could they possibly be to the church when God seems to be specifically pointing out, narrowing it down to people and a land tribal allotment? All of those matters need to be asked and answered. And are there things specifically said in the Old Testament through the prophets that simply don't fit the narrative that the church has replaced Israel, and that they should be brought back in the latter days, which we're in, because God has a bigger purpose to finally reveal to the people? And is there something that's very significant about the people being back in the land of Israel, and that they will come to embrace their Messiah, Jesus, as he will appear to do for them what they cannot do for themselves? Interestingly, very reminiscent of what we just read about here, that Jesus will be the one who will once again rescue the people. God, in the person of Jesus Christ, will come back to put down this rebellion. So where do we have that? Now, over the last couple of sessions in this, we looked at what Amos had to say about God regathering them, and when he does it for the last time, they won't be displaced again. And then ultimately in Jeremiah, when he starts to talk about, I'm going to bring back together Israel and Judah, and the idea that he could bring them both back together in ways that they have not been, and it will be during a time of Jacob's trouble, unlike something that we've seen before. So if the gathering together of Israel and Judah is what's being spoken of, like, say, here, that's not a time of Jacob's trouble. That's after the Assyrians would have been defeated, and it's a time of rejoicing that the people could come back. Well, in Jeremiah chapter 30, God brings them back into the land, and shortly thereafter, there is a time in verse 7 that talks about there's difficulty in the nation yet again, and it's a time of Jacob's trouble, not the church. It's the tribes. It's the people in the land, and there is something that's difficulty. There is a difficulty that's coming against them. Well, Zechariah picks up on this, I believe, and let's turn to Zechariah chapter 12. Excuse me. So Zechariah 12. The books are so small that it's easy to go right past them, so I want to make sure I don't go too far. All right, so chapter 12, we're going to pick it up at verse 10. And this is really kind of one of those places that I love to visit when we are in Israel. And when we are in Nazareth, so when we're up in the north, this is on our first full day of our tour, we make our way to Nazareth. It's our last stop before we head down for the night to Galilee. It's going to be our first night that we stay in Galilee. And as we're in Nazareth, we look across the valley, which is the Valley of Armageddon. It's the Jezreel Valley, or the Valley of Megiddo, of Har Megiddo. And across the way is the ruins of the city of Megiddo. And it would have been a citadel, and a lot of very significant things happened there. Solomon had a place there. He had a place for his horses. There are a number of things that took place there. And so in a very important matter, the King Josiah dies there, and he comes to the assistance and wants to war against Necho, and so he dies at the hands of Pharaoh Necho in that place. And what ends up happening, and the way that the people react to his death, was a national mourning in Jerusalem and in Judah that had not been seen before or since, until we get to chapter 12 at verse 10. So God's speaking about, when you read this, it only figures into something that happens later. So chapters 12, 13, and 14, when you read them, and if you're going to be honest with history, you have to say there's just simply no historical precedent for this ever happening. So if it is future, it fits very nicely, and you'll see. So in that day, he's going to pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication, and then they will look upon me, speaking of God, whom they pierced. And they will mourn, and there's like a change in the language where God the Father speaks of the Son and says, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and they will grieve for him as one grieves for a firstborn. And in that day there will be a great mourning in Jerusalem, like the mourning at Hadad Rimmon in the day in the plain of Megiddo. That's speaking of the place of Megiddo. That's where Josiah died. So when the people of Israel look upon Jesus and recognize who he is, they're going to have a state of mourning and recognition of who he is and what has taken place and how the rejection of him, but also who he is and the embrace of him. And there will be a mourning for what has taken place, yet he will be there as the one who is their Savior, as we read in chapter 14. And we look at that particular part, and it says in verse 1 of chapter 14, behold, the day of the Lord is coming. And again, when you read through this, you just have to ask yourself, given what chapter 12 talks about, really what I believe is during the tribulation is chapter 13, and then there's the return of Jesus as he comes before they can be once again wiped out. Very similar to what we saw at the time when God intervened with the Assyrians. He's going to do so when it's the nations who have gathered themselves together right in the valley outside of Jerusalem. It's what's known as the Valley of Jehoshaphat, or the Kidron Valley. And here's where he comes to do what he does. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and the spoil will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, the women ravished, and half of the city will go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall be cut off from the city. So then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fought in the day of battle. So again, I will just ask this of the people who would be critical. When has this ever happened, and when has this taken place? Because look at what happens next. And in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall split in two from east to west, making a very large valley. Half of the mountain shall move towards the north and half towards the south. And then you shall flee through my mountain valley, for the mountain valley shall reach all the way to Azel. And yes, you will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, the king of Judah. Basically, the references from Amos chapter 1. So once again, this is God speaking about something that historically has had some interesting parallels, but in this case, it's going to be like what had happened the last time, that the nations had gathered against the people, and they had got all the way to the doorstep, and here Jesus intervenes. We know that because the setup for it is chapter 12. The context of chapter 14 begins at chapter 12 in the appearance of Jesus. When we read in Isaiah, we're going to get to it, there's a time when Jesus is seen in the prophetic sense. It says, who is this that comes from Basra with his robe stained in blood? Kind of the same imagery that you get in Revelation 19, which is when Jesus returns and puts down that battle, exactly the one that we're reading about here in chapter 14. It's all the same event. So when you put all the pieces together that speak about the same event, you just go, yeah, well, you put it all together. It's speaking of the same event from a number of different writers at different times and different perspectives, but it's the same event. So again, if you read these and you're just going to be honest with history, when has the Mount of Olives ever had someone stand on it and it splits open and water pours out of it? When has that ever happened? Now, again, when we read all the things, again, especially when we read Joel chapter 3, that's where we realize that it's the Valley of Jehoshaphat where that takes place, and the blood that pools up in that valley, and it doesn't really pool up because it flows outward. It's probably more the carnage, just the bodies that are stacked up. And it's an interesting thing when you stop to think about it, because you just start to put the pieces together. If there was a large volume of water that came out of the Mount of Olives and it washed through the Kidron Valley, through the corpses and everything else, all of that water will go through En-Gedi all the way down into the Dead Sea, and God will replenish it. Now, water that's filled with blood and all the mineral and stuff that goes along with it would have a real interesting effect, though it will be much more supernatural than just that. But we read from what Ezekiel talks about, that the day is going to come when that water will flow out from that area and from the temple area, and it's going to heal the entirety of the sea, the Dead Sea, to the point where it can actually be a place where fishermen will fish. This is all going to happen during the millennium. But, when Jesus comes back, that's at the end of the tribulation, and it sets up the beginning of his 1,000-year reign of his millennial kingdom. Now, not everybody agrees with that. That's fine. They can disagree, that whatever. But you have to read passages like this, and you either have to just make it metaphor and symbols and all the rest of it, rather than just literal. If you're going to make literal fulfillment of this, it's never happened. Just simply has never happened. It'll have to work, and all of those passages in the Old Testament have to work together, speaking of a future time. So interesting stuff. And so that's kind of the culmination of what I wanted to do looking at Israel. First of all, from the very first promises ever made to Abraham, it doesn't have anything to do with the church. It has everything to do with the people and the nation of Israel and the land and the territory. The church and everybody who would come to Jesus, that would be his people. That's the blessing of chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. That's to the nations, plural. It's chapters later where God makes a separate promise to Abraham through one of his descendants and one only, that being Isaac and his sons, and it has to do with land and territory and all of that. So the law was given to Moses. It's not for the church. That's for the children of Israel, and they will once again be established into the land, because that's what the prophets foretell, and they will be once again the focus of the hatred of the devil, and that's spoken about a lot through the book of Revelation, but then ultimately culminating in Jesus returning to the earth, chapter 19, Zechariah 14, Joel chapter 3, the Isaiah passages. There's just so much that talk about the same event, when he will come back and he will once again deliver his people, as he has done multiple times before. So interesting stuff. If you have questions about any of that, please contact me through the ministry's website. That is oldpaththeology.net. We will pick up at chapter 11 next week as we continue through the book of Isaiah. And join us on Thursday. We are going through the book of Matthew as well. So in the New Testament, we've just started the New Testament at the beginning book, Matthew, and we'll start working our way through it again. Because I'd finished at Revelation, we started at Matthew. So again, if you're new to the program, that's how we do this. And any questions on any of what I've shared today, or any other information that you'd like on the Israel trip, or any questions whatsoever, contact us through the ministry's website, and we'd love to hear from you.